Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Shoreline Shells Block of the Month and Quilt Sew Along. Today, I'm going to give you tips as you begin to make your second Shoreline Shells block, an abstract clamshell. In addition to this video, please be sure to refer to the tips included in the pattern, as well as the links below to additional video tutorials. Let's get started. This month we're going to be practicing working with and managing a large paper piece template. It may look a little intimidating at first, but I have some tips to make it manageable. The fantastic thing about this month's block is that we don't have to align and sew paper pieces together to complete the shell. Once we finish paper piecing this one piece, it's done and there are no critical alignments. Yay! Once I have my paper pieces taped up to make paper piece A if I'm working on the circle option, or paper piece B that I have here if I'm working on the grid option, then I'm ready to start paper piecing. I find if I set my workspace up efficiently, the piecing goes fairly quickly. Let me show you what works best for me. I set up here a small table to the left of my sewing machine with my cutting mat, my rotary cutter, I have my ruler, my seam roller, so I can go quickly in between sewing, cutting, and then pressing quickly. So here I have my small little table that I just dragged over next to my sewing machine that you can see here. And we'll go back. Okay, so let's get started here. I went ahead and I attached my first piece of fabric to the back of the paper piece. You could see here I'm covering section 1. I just used a little bit of my water-soluble glue here, attached it. I have the correct side of the fabric facing out, the paper piece here. So again, the most challenging part of this block is dealing just with this large amount of paper. So let me show you what I found works well for me. I'm going to go ahead and using an old gift card, or I have an old hotel room card here. I save lots of these. They're helpful in the studio to have. I'm going to fold back on the line that I'm going to sew on. So here I attached the first piece of fabric to section 1, and I'm going to want to sew on section 2. So I'm going to just fold back along the line between 1 and 2. What I like to do is take my card and have it at the end of a line, and I'll show you why in a minute. I'm going to fold back the paper, and then I'm just going to also make a little line. Again, I could feel the card, and that was at the end of the line, and then I can also just flip it back and kind of indicate where it is the other end of the line that I'm going to be sewing on, which is right about here. I could also kind of put my finger under there. These guides are going to help me when I align the piece of fabric in the next step. So what I want to do first, I find that's helpful for this block specifically, is to cut off the seam allowance from that first piece of fabric. So I'm just going to cut it off 1/4 inch from the folded edge of the paper. And I can get rid of that scrap. And then I went ahead and pre-cut all of my fabric for this block. So I'm going to get this fabric for section 2. I can get rid of that card now. The card is in there. And I'm going to put my pieces of fabric, correct sides of the fabrics together, just like we do with anything. And I'm going to align the raw edge. And then I'm going to make sure that that new piece of fabric, in my case it's yellow, extends beyond this little mark and beyond this little mark. And that way I know when I get it on the machine, it'll be long enough widthwise to cover it. So this is the trick, is sometimes when moving it from here over to our machine, things can shift. Also, we're going to have to flip the paper open. What I found really helpful is to use these mini Wonder Clips by Clover, and especially really like the really narrow ones. They're called mini. There's other ones that are a little bit fatter, but the mini ones work best. And what I do is I just clip it. You could clip it to the paper, but you're going to have to adjust it in a minute. I like to actually just clip it, and I find if they're new that the spring in these clips work really well. I just clip it on the seam allowance, just to hold those two pieces together. If it's a longer piece, or if you want a little bit of extra security, you can add 2. And then I'm going to move it over to the machine. So let me show you what that looks like. Now I'm over on my machine and I'm ready to start sewing. So I need to open this up, and because those clips are there, the fabric should stay right in place. And while those clips are there, I'm going to open it up very carefully, and then I'm going to position my needle where it needs to be, right at the beginning of that line. Before I put my presser foot down, I just want to kind of, with my other hand, go underneath the paper, and I can remove the Wonder Clip now that it is in position. I want to make sure that I don't run the Wonder Clips over, so I removed them. And now I can go ahead and sew. And I like to do a couple of back stitches or stitches in place at the beginning and at the end of the line. And now would be a good time. I can go ahead and check and make sure that when I open up that fabric, it does indeed cover section 2. I can hold it up to a window. I can see through the paper here that it does cover. So let's, before we do anything else, let's go over to the cutting mat and finish up this piece and get prepared for the next. So I have my paper piece that just came off the machine. If for some reason either of these fabric seam allowances were more than 1/4 inch, maybe something shifted or I didn't quite line it up, of course I would go back and just trim that with the paper folded back so that I have 1/4 inch seam allowance. But I did check when I opened it, this yellow did indeed cover all of section 2. So I want to go ahead now and flatten that. So with this piece, I typically just use my seam roller, and I'll put a link below to the one that I really like using. And I'll open it up, and with a lot of force, I want to make sure that presses really well. If you find that your piece is not laying flat, maybe you're not able to give it as much pressure as it needs, or sometimes some flat fabrics have a little bit more of a challenge laying flatter than others. You can certainly go ahead and use a hot iron. But because there's a lot of going back and forth, I find that just having my seam roller, and with this fabric, it's agreeing today. So I think that's good to go. If it is still popping up, you can always go ahead and just put a little bit of water-soluble glue to make it stick down. The one really important thing is you want to make sure that everything is laying nice and flat before you join the next piece. And that's the case for all paper piecing, but especially this one, because it's kind of heartbreaking maybe to find later on in the block that maybe a section over here isn't laying flat. So just go slow. Enjoy the process. If a piece of fabric doesn't completely cover a section, just take a deep breath, grab your seam roller. If you need to, grab some Scotch tape. Scotch tape is your friend. You can always, if the paper is ripping, put a little bit of Scotch tape. I would recommend only putting it on the printed side of the paper, however. I also find with this block, again, I think pre-cutting, I don't always do it, but for this one I did. You can just grab your pieces of fabric and sew. You don't have to worry about cutting as you go. And I find that with this block especially, it just makes the process more enjoyable. So let's go one more piece. I will get prepped for the next one. I have sections 1 and 2 covered, and now I want to cover section 3. So just like I did, let me show you again what I would do. I would put my room card on the line that goes between, for this case, it's 1 and 2 are done. So now I'm going to join on 3. I like to align it right at the end of the line, my card, along the edge of the line. My card is along the edge of the line. This top of the card is, I'm going to position right at the beginning of the line that I'm going to sew on. I'm going to fold it back. I like to make a little line here. You may find that you have lots of lines. I can erase very gently the previous line. I could mark the other end of the line. However, because I pre-cut, I know that if I just position the piece of fabric in a minute in relation to that line, it'll just fall in place. But before I do that, I'm going to cut off the seam allowance. Having this extra seam allowance, using this, if you're going to do this technique, really helps a lot. It makes life a lot easier. So I'm going to grab my fabric for section 3 that I have pre-cut here. And then I'm just going to put correct side of the fabric touching the correct side of the fabric here. I still have that card key in here. I can remove the card. So correct side of the fabric touching correct side of the fabric, aligning the raw edge. And I'm going to position, how I know how to position it this way is I'm going to position it, I made that little mark there, a little bit past, at least a ½ inch, or I should say at least a1/4 inch past that, aligning the raw edge. I'll then grab my clips, and I could do 1 clip. I usually find 1 is enough, but because I'm moving it a little bit further, it's not right next to my machine, I'll do 2. And now I'm ready to bring this over to the machine and sew it. I would open it up and I'll just sew along that line. I just came back from the machine and I sewed section 3, and I opened it up to make sure that it does indeed cover section 3. I just put it up to a window. I'm going to go ahead and press that. And again, I just want to stress, if you're going to be using this clover clip to secure your piece before you sew it, make sure that you remove those clover clips before you bring your presser foot down on your machine. You want to make sure that you don't do any damage to your machine and it's nice and free and clear. So I'm ready to continue sewing along and filling up my sections. I want to point out one other thing to be on the lookout as you're aligning your fabric pieces to ensure that they cover the section that you want to cover. Here I'm working on section 9 and I'm about to put my card down to flip it up, and I could see the beginning of the line that I'm going to sew on starts here and ends here, and I could see at the beginning the section goes a little bit more sort of to the left of where I'm going to be, or above where I'm going to be sewing. So I would just want to make sure that if I am using my method of making a mark where the card is, where the line is, the sewing line starts, that I want to just be aware that the fabric piece needs to be shifted a little bit further up to accommodate this little notch. So I could either shift the card up in line with that, or kind of eyeball it against a window and know where to make the mark. So just something to be aware of as you're sewing along. And so I made that mark, and now I know when I place my fabric, right sides together, again, correct side to correct side, there's that mark I made that indicated where the section actually is, and I can have it go a little bit past that. So just something to be aware of. So working with these larger paper pieces can be a little bit awkward. I will say that it does get easier with practice, and also as you start to work out and towards the edge of the paper, you will find that it gets easier because there'll be less bulk. So once you fill up this paper piece, again, your reward is it's done. The shell is done. There's nothing else to sew onto it, and you'll have a beautiful curved piece to show for it. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to call out 2 things, one for the circle block option and one for the grid block option. For the circle block option, once you paper piece A, you'll then arrange and sew background templates Y and Z, even if you're making the sea glass center for your quilt. There's no sea glass that appears in this part of the quilt. Let's take a look at the grid block options. So for both grid block options, you'll paper piece B, and then for grid block option 1, You're going to also paper piece pieces C and D and add those on. So your block will measure 20.5 by 16.5. If you're making grid block option 2, your block is complete after you paper piece B. You do not need to paper piece C or D. For grid block option 2, you'll just need paper piece B, and your block will measure 16.5 inches by 16.5 inches. I can't wait to see your blocks come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with even more tips. In the meantime, if you have a question or comments or something you'd like me to share in a future video, please let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to share your progress on Instagram using the Shoreline Shells hashtags found on the pattern so we can all check out what you're working on. You can also email me photos. I love to see what you're working on. Thanks again for being here. See you next month and happy sewing.